The Body Knows, Episode 23, The Language of Boundaries. Welcome back to The Body Knows. In the last episode, we sat with the paradox of desire and fear, how the body longs for closeness and yet pulls back from vulnerability. Today, we take the next step in that journey. Because if desire and fear are always in conversation, then the way we manage that conversation is through boundaries. Boundaries are not abstract lines or rigid rules. They are living expressions of the body's language, the way the nervous system says yes, no, maybe not now, or only this much. Boundaries is the body's speech too often. Boundaries are talked about as if they're external, something we draw on a page, something we declare to others, something that exists out there. But the deeper truth is that boundaries begin within. Before we ever speak a word, before we ever make a choice, the body has already signaled. Our skin tightens, our chest expands, our breath grows shallow or full, our muscles lean in or pull away. Boundaries are not invented by the mind. They are first announced by the body. Think about the skin. The skin is our first boundary. It separates inside from outside, me from you, safe from unsafe. But skin is not a wall, it breathes. It exchanges. It allows warmth and connection while shielding against harm. This is the paradox of all boundaries. They separate, but they also connect. Without skin, there would be no body. Without boundaries, there is no intimacy, because intimacy without separation collapses into enmeshment. Gut, too, is a boundary. It chooses what to absorb and what to reject. When we eat, the body sorts nutrients from waste, nourishment from toxins. And in the same way, the nervous system sorts experiences. It asks, is this safe to take in or must I expel it? Is this food for growth or poison to reject? Every moment of interaction is a kind of digestion. Boundaries are the metabolism of the soul. The nervous system itself is boundary making. The fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses are nothing more than boundary responses. Fight says, I will push you back, you've come too close. Flight says, I will remove myself, your presence overwhelms me. Freeze says, I cannot escape, so I will make myself small, invisible, still. Fawn says, I cannot resist you, so I will merge with your demand to protect myself. These are not moral choices. They are automatic boundary negotiations, the body's ancient grammar for survival. And yet, many of us don't hear this grammar clearly. We've been conditioned to override it, to suppress it, to treat our no as selfish, our yes as an obligation, our hesitation as weakness. From childhood, families, schools, religions, and cultures often teach us that pleasing others matters more than respecting our own limits. We are told to hug relatives even when we don't want to. We are told to share toys even when we feel unsafe. We are told to sit still and smile politely even when our body aches to move or cry. Over time, we learn to mistrust our boundaries. The body whispers no, but the mind overrides yes. And what follows is guilt. Guilt for wanting what we want. Guilt for refusing what we don't. Let me give you a simple scenario. A friend invites you to an event. Inside, your body feels heavy. You notice a knot in your stomach. You long for rest, solitude, maybe just a quiet night. But as soon as the word no forms in your mind, guilt surges. You imagine your friend's disappointment. You picture being labeled rude, selfish, and uncaring. And so you say yes, you override the body's no. What happened there? The body spoke, but another voice shouted louder, the voice of conditioning. And the guilt you felt wasn't proof that you were wrong. It was proof that your nervous system was caught between two authorities, your authentic signal and the learned script. The guilt was the clash of those two worlds. Boundaries, then, are not just about saying yes or no. They are about discerning which voice we listen to, the body's or the world's. They are about trusting the nervous system as a truth teller, even when culture calls it selfish. The tragedy is that most of us are never taught this. Boundaries are moralized rather than honored. They're framed as right or wrong instead of safe or unsafe. In relationships, this becomes devastating. How many times have you stayed in a conversation, a friendship, a romance, long after your body whispered leave? How many times have you given more than you had because saying no felt like betrayal? How many times have you accepted a touch, a demand, a silence when every fiber in your body screamed no, and yet you smiled, complied, endured? These are not failures of character. They are failures of culture. They are the result of systems that trained us to mistrust our own bodies. And so the journey of healing becomes a journey of retranslation, of learning to hear the body's speech again, to trust it, to live by it. The language of boundaries is subtle. Sometimes it comes as tension in the shoulders. Sometimes there is an expansion in the chest. Sometimes nausea, headache, and dissociation. Sometimes as warmth, ease, and laughter. Every sensation is a word. Every signal is a syllable. Together they form sentences that say, this is safe, this is too much, this is what I long for, this is what I refuse. And like any language, fluency comes with practice. At first we mistranslate it. We confuse guilt for love, obligation for care, and collapse for generosity. We hear the body faintly beneath the static of cultural expectation. But slowly, if we listen, the grammar returns. We begin to know the difference between a real yes and a masked yes, between a grounded no and a fearful no. between what the world demands and what the body permits. Here is the heart of the matter. Boundaries are not barriers against love. They are the precondition of love. To say yes without the power to say no is not love, it is compliance. To give without the freedom to refuse is not generosity, it is coercion. To touch without consent is not intimacy, it is violation. Boundaries protect not just the self, but the possibility of authentic connection. They ensure that what is shared is freely chosen, not extracted. So as we begin this episode, I invite you to sit with this. The boundary is the body's first language. Before words, before thought, there was the skin, the gut, the nervous system. And every time we honor those signals, we speak truth. As we move forward, we'll look at how this plays out in physiology, in culture, in philosophy, and in lived experience. But for now, let's return to the scenario. You say no to the invitation, you feel guilt. Pause there. In that pause is everything. The guilt is not proof of failure. It is proof of conditioning. It is the nervous system showing you where authenticity collides with expectation. And in that moment, you have a choice, to betray the body for approval or to honor the body for integrity. Neither choice is easy, but one leads to exhaustion, resentment, and collapse. The other leads slowly to authenticity, presence, and peace. This is what we'll explore in this episode. Boundaries not as walls, not as punishments, not as selfish refusals, but as the nervous system's speech, the body's way of saying, here I end and here you begin. Here is what I can give, and here is what I must withhold. Here is how I remain myself, so that I may meet you as myself, because the body always knows. And the more we listen, the more fluent we become in the language of boundaries. The physiology of yes and no. If the introduction showed us that boundaries are the body's speech, then physiology is the grammar. Every yes and no we feel arises from specific biological processes, nerve pathways, chemical messengers, muscular responses, and brain circuits that have been sculpted by both evolution and experience. To understand boundaries deeply, we must look not just at psychology or culture, but at how the nervous system itself shapes and enforces them. Let's start with the basics. The nervous system is not one single thing, but a layered orchestra. The amygdala scans constantly for danger, processing emotional salience before the conscious mind has a chance to intervene. The vagus nerve acts as a great communicator, linking the brain to the heart, lungs, and gut. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain often celebrated for rationality, is in truth more like a negotiator, weighing bodily impulses against cultural demands. Every time you feel a pull toward yes or a resistance toward no, these three centers, amygdala, vagus, and prefrontal cortex, are in conversation. The amygdala. First gate of danger and desire, the amygdala is ancient. It doesn't think in words. It doesn't calculate in logic. It deals in raw signals, threat, safety, approach, and avoidance. When someone asks you for something, time, attention, or intimacy, the amygdala fires almost instantly. If the tone feels safe, if the body posture communicates warmth, if the context is familiar, you might feel an ease that prepares you to say yes. But if the tone carries aggression, if the posture feels intrusive, if the memory it awakens is one of pain, the amygdala lights up like an alarm bell. Even before you form the thought, I don't want this, your body has already braced itself. That bracing might come as a tightening in the gut, or as shoulders rising towards ears, or as a subtle increase in heart rate. These are the amygdala's whispers. They do not lie, but because they speak before words, they are often dismissed. We tell ourselves, I'm overreacting, I should be generous, I should give them what they want. And in doing so, we override the amygdala's early signal, leaving ourselves more vulnerable to stress, resentment, or even danger. The vagus nerve, mediator of connection. Then there is the vagus nerve, a wandering nerve that extends from the brainstem to the torso, touching the heart, lungs, and digestive tract. Polyvagal theory, developed by Stephen Porges, helps us see that this nerve doesn't just regulate body functions. It is also the nervous system's social connector. When the vagus is in its ventral state, we feel safe, grounded, and open. Our yes comes easily, not from fear but from genuine desire. But when the vagus slides into dorsal shutdown, or when sympathetic fight-flight takes over, our no emerges. Sometimes it is a loud no, a snap, an explosion. Other times it is a silent no, dissociation, retreat, or numbness. The vagus is also why boundaries can feel so contradictory. Because it links body and sociality, it carries not only signals of self-protection, but also signals of belonging. When you say no, you may feel guilt, not because you've done something wrong, but because your vagus is registering a potential rupture in connection. To the body, rejection risks abandonment. The nervous system fears isolation as much as it fears physical harm. Thus, every no-risk feeling is like exile. The prefrontal cortex, negotiator and storyteller. Finally, the prefrontal cortex. This is where we make meaning of bodily impulses. It does not generate the initial yes or no, but it spins stories about them. You feel a gut no, but your prefrontal cortex says, don't be rude. They'll think you're selfish. Or you feel a warm yes, but your prefrontal cortex says, be careful, they might take advantage of you. This region is shaped heavily by childhood conditioning. If you were praised for compliance, your prefrontal cortex may work overtime to suppress no. If you were shamed for asking, it may shrink your yes. This negotiation is constant. Every social interaction involves this three-way dialogue. The amygdala's raw signal, the vagus nerve's relational tone, the prefrontal cortex's narrative spin. Boundaries live at their intersection. Why saying no feels like danger? Have you ever wondered why saying no feels physically threatening? Why does your heart race, your palms sweat, your throat tighten? It's because no is not just a word. It is a neural event that can be registered as rebellion. For a child, saying no to a parent might have meant punishment, withdrawal of love, or even violence. The nervous system encodes that lesson. As an adult, every attempt to assert a boundary can awaken those same danger circuits. The body remembers. Here is where fight, flight, freeze, and fawn enter. When you prepare to assert a boundary, your nervous system may fight. You blurt out no with sharpness, defensiveness, sometimes more intensity than the situation requires. Flight. You dodge, avoid, make excuses, disappear rather than risk confrontation. Fawn. You say yes, over-accommodate, mask your true needs to maintain harmony. These are not moral failings. They are survival adaptations. They are the nervous system's inherited strategies for negotiating threat. The biology of consent. Now let's talk about the biology of consent. Consent is not only a moral principle, it is a neurobiological necessity. When yes is authentic, the body releases oxytocin, promoting trust and bonding. When no is respected, cortisol levels settle, heart rate slows, and safety deepens. But when no is violated, or when yes is coerced, the body responds with stress chemistry. Cortisol rises, the amygdala stays hypervigilant, the vagus nerve loses tone. What follows is not connection, but trauma. This is why the biology of consent is sacred. It's not about being politically correct. It's about respecting the body's truth. Every authentic yes strengthens trust. Every violation does not weaken it. Over time, relationships built on ignored boundaries collapse under the weight of unspoken resentment, shame, or pain. Scenario. Fawning instead of no. Let's return to a scenario. Imagine you are invited to join a project at work. You feel tired, overextended, and the thought of saying yes makes your body tense. Your shoulders ache, your breath shortens. But the request comes with flattery. We really need you. You're the only one who can do this. Your vagus nerve registers the social pull. Your prefrontal cortex reminds you of past praise for being reliable. And so you override the no. You say yes. What happens then? At first, oxytocin gives you a brief sense of belonging. But soon cortisol rises as the body recognizes betrayal of its own signal. Fatigue deepens. Resentment brews. You feel trapped. The yes was not a yes but a fawn response. And in the long run, that false yes erodes both trust in yourself and trust in the relationship. This is the physiology of boundaries in action. Every choice leaves a trace. Every yes or no either strengthens the body's trust in itself or weakens it. Over time, our health depends on these micro decisions. Chronic stress often comes not one dramatic violation, but from thousands of small ignored no's, thousands of false yeses. Why this matters for healing when trauma survivors struggle with boundaries, it is not simply a matter of willpower. It is biology. Their amygdala may fire more easily, detecting threat where others feel none. Their vagus nerve may slip more quickly into dorsal shutdown, creating numbness or dissociation. Their prefrontal cortex may have been conditioned to silence the body's signals entirely. Telling someone like this to just say no is cruel. It ignores the real physiology of survival. Healing, then, is not about forcefully declaring boundaries, but about slowly retraining the nervous system, learning to tolerate the bodily sensations of no, learning to breathe through the guilt, learning to let the prefrontal cortex tell a new story, that no is safe, no is allowed, no is love. Boundaries are not made of walls. They are made of nerves, muscles, hormones, and breath. They are made of the body's constant dialogue with itself. To honor them is to honor biology. To betray them is to betray the body. So as we move forward, keep this in mind. Every boundary begins with physiology. Every yes and no is first a chemical shift, an electrical signal, a muscular contraction. The body speaks first. The question is, will we listen? Cultural conditioning and broken boundaries. We've seen how physiology gives us the grammar of yes and no, but biology never speaks in isolation. From the moment we are born, our nervous systems are embedded in families, schools, religions, and cultures. These institutions don't just influence how we behave. They shape the way we hear and respond to our own boundaries. They reward compliance, punish resistance, and moralize the very act of saying no. Over time, this conditioning becomes so powerful that we mistake it for our nature. Families, where the script begins, the first boundaries we encounter are not our own. They are our caregivers. A baby cries and the parent responds or doesn't. A toddler reaches for independence and the parent supports or suppresses. These early interactions write the nervous system's script for how safe it feels to assert needs. If parents encourage autonomy, the child learns that no is tolerated, that limits can coexist with love. But if parents punish defiance, withdraw affection, or demand compliance at all costs, the child learns another lesson. No is dangerous. Think of the common moment when a child resists hugging a relative. The child's body says no. They pull away, turn their head, stiffen. But the parent insists, go on, hug grandma. Don't be rude. The child complies. On the surface, it was a harmless act of politeness. But underneath, the nervous system records, my no is meaningless. My body's signals can be overridden. Compliance is safer than authenticity. That lesson doesn't stay in childhood. It echoes in adulthood when the same person struggles to refuse intimacy they don't want or to assert needs in relationships. Families also pass down gendered expectations. Sons may be praised for independence, punished for vulnerability. Daughters may be praised for compliance, punished for assertiveness. Both messages distort boundaries, but in opposite directions. Schools, the training ground of compliance. If families plant the seeds, schools water them. The classroom is less about education than about learning to suppress bodily signals. Sit still even when your legs ache. Stay silent even when your mind races with questions. Ask permission to use the bathroom as though your body's needs require external validation. What schools call discipline is often a training in dissociation. Children are taught to distrust hunger, fatigue, restlessness, and curiosity. Their natural signals are reframed as distractions, disruptions, or even sins. The body says move, but the teacher says sit. The body says ask, but the teacher says silence. Over time, the nervous system adapts. It learns that survival in this institution requires overriding its own truth. And because school occupies so many of our formative years, this override becomes habitual. By adulthood, many of us cannot distinguish authentic desire from conditioned obligation. We've been rewarded for betraying the body so often that it feels natural. Religion, moralizing the boundary religion too, plays its role. Many traditions sanctify obedience over autonomy, submission over authenticity. Honor your father and mother becomes in practice. Do not resist authority. Desire itself may be labeled sinful. Pleasure without approval is dangerous. The body's no becomes rebellion. The body's yes becomes temptation. For those raised in such systems, boundaries are not simply difficult. They are framed as immoral. Saying no to authority risks not just punishment but eternal damnation. This reframing of boundaries as moral failure creates deep guilt and shame that can last a lifetime. Workplaces, compliance as professionalism. As adults, the workplace extends the same script. Saying no to extra work risks being labeled uncommitted. Saying no to toxic colleagues risks being called difficult. In many workplaces, the nervous system learns that boundaries are not professional. Survival means constant yes, constant availability, constant suppression of bodily truth. Burnout, then, is not a mystery. It is the predictable result of thousands of micro-boundary violations, rewarded by paychecks but punished by the body. Gendered conditioning. Two sides of the same distortion, gender intensifies this cultural script. Women across many cultures are taught that saying no risks rejection, punishment, or violence. They are taught to smile, accommodate, and soften their edges. Men, meanwhile, are often taught that saying yes to vulnerability, tenderness, or refusal of aggression risks emasculation. Both messages distort the body's natural boundary signals. For women, the body's no is silenced. For men, the body's yes to gentleness, to softness, is shamed. Both are left estranged from authenticity. And when these distortions meet in relationships, the results are painful. One partner may struggle to assert limits, fearing abandonment. The other may struggle to soften, fearing weakness. The dance becomes one of projection and misunderstanding rather than connection. Neurodivergence, heightened struggles with boundaries. For autistic and ADHD individuals, these dynamics are amplified. Autistic children often have intense sensory boundaries. A light touch may feel overwhelming. A certain sound may cause pain. But instead of honoring these boundaries, culture frames them as behavioral problems. Don't be so sensitive. Stop making a fuss. The child learns not that their boundaries are valid, but they are inconvenient. Similarly, ADHD children may struggle to notice boundaries, their own or others, because of impulsivity, hyperfocus, or sensory seeking. Instead of being supported to navigate these differences, they are often punished. Their noise becomes disruptive. Their yes becomes reckless. Over time, shame grows and boundaries collapse further. Neurodivergence reveals the truth we all share, that boundaries are not abstract rules but embodied signals. The difference is that for neurodivergent people, those signals are louder, sharper, harder to ignore. But culture still demands compliance, leaving them even more vulnerable to shame and self-doubt. The moralization of boundaries. Across all these contexts, a pattern emerges. Boundaries are moralized rather than respected. Saying no is selfish. Saying yes is virtuous. Refusing is rude. Complying is polite. Boundaries become measures of character rather than expressions of safety. This moralization distorts our perception. Instead of asking, is this safe for me? We ask, will this make me look good? Instead of honoring the body, we perform for the culture. Example, punished for refusing a hug. Consider a child punished for refusing a hug. Their body says no, perhaps from overwhelm, perhaps from discomfort. But the adult insists, the child is shamed. Don't be so ungrateful. Don't embarrass me. The body's signal is dismissed. The lesson, your no is invalid. Your body is not yours. Affection is an obligation, not a choice. Fast forward 20 years, that child, now an adult, struggles with physical boundaries in relationships. They may accept touch they don't want, fearing they'll be seen as cold. They may suppress their anger until it erupts as rage. The original lesson lives on, their body's signals don't matter. Why this matters? When we look at the rise of anxiety, depression, and burnout, we often search for complex explanations. But much of it comes down to this, a culture that punishes boundaries. A culture that teaches us to ignore our nervous systems. A culture that moralizes compliance and demonizes authenticity. Healing, then, requires more than personal work. It requires cultural critique. To reclaim our boundaries, we must also see how they were broken in families, schools, religions, and workplaces. We must name the conditioning so we can resist it. Philosophical and cross-cultural views. So far, we've looked at boundaries through biology and culture. But there is another layer, the philosophical and cross-cultural perspectives that shape how humans across history and geography have thought about self, other, and the invisible line that connects and separates them. Boundaries are not just personal strategies. They are reflections of how entire societies define the self in relation to the world. The paradox of boundaries, at the heart of boundaries lies a paradox. They divide, yet they connect. To say this is me is to also say this is not you. Yet without that distinction, connection becomes impossible. If I cannot recognize where I end and you begin, then intimacy collapses into enmeshment. To honor difference is to create the conditions for authentic union. This paradox has been recognized in philosophies across time. In Western traditions, autonomy is often elevated, the sovereign individual, self-contained, responsible. In Eastern and indigenous traditions, boundaries are more relational, defined not by rigid walls but by fluid exchanges of responsibility and care. Both perspectives have wisdom to offer, and both can become distortions if taken to extremes. Western philosophy, autonomy and sovereignty. In Western thought, boundaries are deeply tied to autonomy. Think of Kant, who argued that true moral action is only possible when the individual acts from free will, not coercion. Boundaries, in this frame, are what protect the capacity to choose. Without them, there is no freedom, only manipulation. Later thinkers such as John Stuart Mill extended this into political philosophy. The harm principle, which insists that individuals should be free to act however they wish, provided they do not harm others. Here, boundaries are social contracts, invisible lines that enable freedom by limiting intrusion. This view has immense value. It insists that no is sacred, that consent is foundational. But it can also overemphasize the self, neglecting the interdependence that makes us human. Taken to an extreme, it becomes rugged individualism, a boundary so rigid it isolates. Indigenous perspectives. Relational boundaries, by contrast. Many indigenous traditions conceive of boundaries not as walls but as webs. The self is not an isolated unit but a node in a living network. Boundaries, then, are less about rigid separation and more about maintaining balance in a relationship. In some Native American traditions, for example, boundaries are taught through respect for all beings, human, animal, land, and spirit. A no is not a rejection but a way of honoring balance. Consent extends beyond human relationships into ecological ones. The river has boundaries, the forest has boundaries. To trespass without care is to violate not just nature, but the sacred. Similarly, in Maori culture, the concept of tapu designates sacred restrictions, spaces, objects, or behaviors that must not be crossed without ritual permission. Boundaries here are not about individual sovereignty, but collective well-being. They create safety by embedding the self in a larger relational order. These traditions remind us that boundaries are not only about protecting the self from the other, they are also about protecting the relationship from distortion. Mystical traditions. Dissolving and renewing boundaries, mystical traditions add yet another layer. In Christian mysticism, in Sufi Islam, in Buddhist meditation, practitioners often speak of dissolving the boundary between self and divine, self and cosmos. Here the aim is not to reinforce the no, but to transcend it, to experience unity beyond division. Yet even here paradox persists. Mystical union is not meant to obliterate the self permanently. It is often followed by a return, a re-entering of the world, carrying new compassion for self and others. The boundary dissolves only to be renewed, this time infused with awareness that separation and connection are two sides of the same truth. In Buddhism, the teaching of anatta, no self, points to the impermanence of all boundaries. Yet Buddhist ethics still emphasize right relationship, right speech, right action. In other words, even in traditions that transcend boundaries, there is still respect for the embodied lines that protect safety and dignity. Gender and power in philosophy, feminist philosophy, has offered vital critiques of how boundaries are culturally gendered. Thinkers like Simone de Beauvoir, bell hooks, and Judith Butler highlight how women's boundaries have historically been dismissed or violated, while men's boundaries have been overly protected. To reclaim no in this sense is not just personal healing but political resistance. Feminist perspectives also highlight the double standard. Women who set boundaries are labeled cold, selfish, or hysterical, while men who set them are praised as assertive. These asymmetries reveal that boundaries are never just personal choices. They are embedded in power structures, cross-cultural tensions, porous versus rigid boundaries. Anthropology shows us that cultures vary widely in how boundaries are practiced. In some Mediterranean and Latin American contexts, social boundaries are porous, warmth, touch, and overlapping conversations are signs of intimacy. In Northern European contexts, boundaries are rigid, personal space, quiet, and privacy are signs of respect. Neither is inherently right nor wrong. But problems emerge when we interpret another culture's boundary language through our own. What feels like warmth to one person may feel like an intrusion to another. What feels like respect to one may feel like coldness to another. Misunderstanding arises not because one is right and the other is wrong, but because boundary languages differ. Boundaries as a paradoxical connection, philosophy, mysticism, and anthropology all return us to the paradox. Boundaries separate and connect. They protect the self, but they also protect the relationship. They enable autonomy, but they also enable intimacy. This is why healing our relationship to boundaries matters so deeply. When we see them only as walls, we risk isolation. When we ignore them, we risk collapse. The art is in balance, in holding both self and other, autonomy and connection, separation and intimacy. Reflection. Boundaries as love, seen in this light. Boundaries are not barriers to love, but expressions of it. To say no is to protect the conditions for an authentic yes. To honor another's no is to safeguard trust. Boundaries are not rejections of a relationship, but the very thing that makes a relationship possible. This is where philosophy meets physiology, where culture meets biology. The nervous system signals of yes and no find expression in cultural scripts, philosophical theories, and mystical practices. And as we weave them together, we see that boundaries are not just personal quirks but universal truths, ancient, sacred, necessary. Personal reflections. Learning my own no boundaries are never just concepts in books or theories on paper. They are lived realities. They show up in the body, in relationships, in the subtle dynamics of how we give and withhold ourselves. For me, boundaries have always been a complex and sometimes painful terrain. They were there, but they weren't respected. And when they weren't respected, I often lacked the self-worth to defend them. Boundaries that vanished under pressure. As I look back on my early adult life, I see moments where I did set boundaries. I said no, I tried to hold my ground. But what happened more often than not was that those boundaries were ignored, dismissed, or pushed aside. Instead of standing firm, I would let people cross them. Sometimes it was because I cared for them. Sometimes it was because I wanted to preserve the relationship at all costs. Sometimes it was simply because I lacked the confidence to say, my no is non-negotiable. At the time, it felt easier to let others pass my boundaries than to risk rejection, conflict, or abandonment. But looking back, I can see the cost. Every time I allowed someone to overstep, it wasn't just a momentary discomfort. It was a gradual erosion of self. It was a slow dissolving of my sense of worth until there were times I felt invisible. My no didn't matter. My needs didn't matter. Even new beginnings, jobs, friendships, and relationships carried that same undertone. I was expected to notice and respect others, but they rarely extended the same courtesy to me. That imbalance didn't just hurt. It taught me something corrosive, that my needs were less important than others, that my boundaries could be bargained away, that love or acceptance required self-erasure. This belief seeped into my nervous system, becoming not just an idea but a bodily habit. The double standard of boundaries. It's striking how often this double standard shows up. From childhood, I was taught implicitly that respecting other people's boundaries was a requirement of being good, polite, and well-behaved. But my own boundaries? Those were seen as selfish, dramatic, and unnecessary. If I said no, I was awkward. If I resisted, I was rude. If I asked for space, I was ungrateful. This double standard left me in a bind. On the one hand, I carried guilt whenever I tried to hold a boundary. On the other hand, I carried resentment and pain when my boundaries were ignored. The nervous system doesn't know how to reconcile those opposing messages. It vacillates between fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, sometimes lashing out, sometimes shutting down, sometimes over-explaining and appeasing. The result is exhaustion, a body pulled in opposite directions, red flags ignored, lessons learned. The most painful part of ignoring boundaries is how costly it can become. Looking past red flags, because I wanted to give someone a chance, because I hoped time would fix things, because I thought love meant tolerance, ended up being one of the most expensive mistakes I made. It cost me my self-respect, it cost me my peace. It led to situations where my mental health suffered profoundly. I used to think ignoring those red flags was generosity or kindness or commitment. Now I see it more clearly. It was self-abandonment. It was choosing the illusion of connection over the reality of respect. It was mistaking compromise for love, when in fact it was the slow death of authenticity. And this is where the nervous system speaks so loudly. Every time I overrode my own boundaries, my body kept the score. It is remembered in muscle tension, in anxiety, in sleepless nights, in anger that would build and eventually erupt. What I thought I was avoiding, rejection, conflict, loss, came anyway, only with more damage because I'd abandoned myself along the way. The spiritual journey of no things began to shift after my spiritual awakening 8 years ago. Suddenly, I could no longer hide from the fractures within me. The shadow was exposed. I saw clearly how much of my life had been shaped by the inability to honor my boundaries. It wasn't just about external relationships, it was about my relationship with myself. That awakening gave me two insights. First, that boundaries are not walls but acts of love. They are ways of protecting my authenticity, my energy, my capacity to connect meaningfully. Second, that saying no is not just about others, it is about saying yes to myself. I began to notice how much of my life was organized around pleasing others, around avoiding conflict, around making sure I wasn't rejected. I saw how this pattern had been reinforced in family, school, relationships, and even in spiritual communities. And I began to experiment with something radical for me. I began to say no, even when it was uncomfortable. It wasn't easy. The first few times I set boundaries, the backlash was intense. People projected. They called me fickle, cold, and mean. They accused me of being uncaring or selfish. But instead of collapsing under those accusations, I began to see them differently. I realized those projections weren't about me. They were about their own defenses, their own discomfort with limits. My no was simply exposing their inability to hear no without making it personal. Boundaries as real-time truth. One of the greatest lessons I've learned is that boundaries happen in real time. They are not theoretical lines we draw in abstract. They are lived, moment-to-moment choices rooted in sensation and awareness. In the past, I often ignored what my body was telling me. I thought, if I just give it time, things will work out. I prioritized endurance over immediacy. But what I've learned is that authenticity doesn't need endless time. It reveals itself quickly in real time. If someone says or does something unfair, my body responds immediately. I feel the contraction, the tightening, the heaviness. That is the moment of truth. To ignore it is to abandon myself. To honor it is to stay aligned with myself. Now, I don't give second or third chances when the first encounter shows a lack of respect. That may sound harsh, but I see it as clarity. Respect and love don't need endless proof. They show themselves quickly, just as disrespect and neglect do. Acting in real time means listening to my body's signals rather than rationalizing them away. Systemic abuse and the bigger picture. Of course, personal boundaries don't exist in a vacuum. I've spoken often in the Inversiverse and Unfiltered Human about how systemic abuse shapes individual behavior. The refusal to respect boundaries is not just a personal flaw, it is part of a wider system of control. From governments to corporations to religious institutions, we are trained to tolerate intrusion, gaslighting, and manipulation. We are taught that saying no to authority is dangerous. We are bombarded with messages that make self-abandonment seem normal, even noble. No wonder so many of us struggle in our personal lives. We are carrying scripts written by a culture that depends on compliance. For me, recognizing this bigger picture has been liberating. It helps me see that my struggles with boundaries were not personal failures, but systemic consequences. It also reminds me that healing is not just for me. Every time I honor my own no, I am resisting those systems. I am modeling something different for my relationships, for my community, for society. Where I stand now today, I stand in a different place. I no longer see boundaries as rejection. I see them as love. I no longer see no as selfish. I see it as sacred. I no longer abandon myself to keep others comfortable. I honor my discomfort as a signal that matters. That doesn't mean it's easy. Boundaries still bring guilt. They still provoke projections. But I hold them anyway, because I know the cost of not holding them. And I know that when I honor my no, my yes becomes more authentic, more joyful, more free. The journey of learning my own no has been long and often painful, but it has also been the foundation of healing. It has taught me that love without boundaries is not love. Connection without respect is not connection. And self-worth without self-protection is fragile at best. Boundaries are not about pushing people away. They are about making real intimacy possible. They are not about selfishness. They are about sovereignty. They are not about loss. They are about love for myself, for others, for the relationships I want to cultivate. Boundaries in relationships. If boundaries are the grammar of intimacy, then relationships are the sentences we build with them. Every connection, whether romantic, familial, or platonic, is written in the language of yes and no. The health of the relationship depends not on how often yes is spoken, but on how no is respected. When boundaries collapse, intimacy doesn't deepen, it erodes. When boundaries are honored, trust flourishes. Relationships rise and fall on this truth. And yet, this is the area where boundaries are most consistently tested, broken, or ignored. The cycle of unclear boundaries. Think of a relationship where boundaries are unclear. At first, there may be closeness, even intensity, but soon, resentment builds. One partner gives more than they want to, but doesn't say no. The other takes more than they should without noticing the unspoken discomfort. Eventually, the giver feels drained and bitter, the taker feels entitled and oblivious, and the bond begins to fray. This cycle can appear in many forms: pursuit and withdrawal, oversharing and shutting down, enmeshment and avoidance. The nervous system responds in kind, oscillating between craving closeness and fearing engulfment, between needing independence and fearing abandonment. Unclear boundaries don't just create psychological tension, they dysregulate the body. The vagus nerve, which signals safety and connection, begins to send mixed signals. Oxytocin, the hormone of bonding, becomes tainted with cortisol, the hormone of stress. The relationship feels simultaneously addictive and exhausting. Trauma bonding and the collapse of boundaries. In more extreme cases, unclear boundaries morph into trauma bonding. This happens when cycles of love and harm, care and neglect, fuse in a way that makes it hard to leave. A partner who violates boundaries apologizes, promises change, showers affection, only to repeat the violation. The nervous system becomes trapped in a loop, anticipating the next hurt, craving the next repair. I've spoken before about how systems of control operate in similar ways, such as governments, cults, and corporations. They exploit the nervous system by alternating reward and punishment, closeness and rejection. The same is true in abusive relationships. Boundaries are not just ignored, they are weaponized. The abuser tests them, breaks them, then rebuilds them on their terms. The result is confusion, dependency, and self-doubt. In these contexts, leaving is not just a choice, it is a survival act. But it is also one of the hardest acts to make, because the nervous system has learned to equate chaos with love, violation with intimacy. Scenario: intimacy pushed too soon. Imagine a partner pushes for intimacy before the body feels ready. The skin tightens, the breath shortens. The nervous system says no, but fear of rejection overrides the signal. The yes is spoken, but it is false. Later, resentment simmers. The partner wonders why the intimacy felt hollow, why the connection seemed forced. The answer lies not in the act itself, but in the boundary violation, the ignoring of the body's no. Over time, patterns like this don't just harm trust, they teach the body that its signals don't matter. Dissociation becomes the only escape. Intimacy becomes something endured rather than embraced, and relationships lose their foundation. Personal reflection, learning real-time clarity. In my own life, I've lived through the consequences of unclear boundaries. I've tolerated disrespect, ignored red flags, and stayed in relationships long after my body was screaming to leave. I used to believe that time would heal what was broken, that endurance was proof of love. But what I've learned is that boundaries are real-time truths. They are not negotiable in the long run. If someone shows me early on that they cannot respect me, that is not going to change with months or years of effort. I remember times when I tried to explain my needs, only to be met with dismissal, mockery, or projection. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. You don't care enough. For a long time, I internalized those accusations. I wondered if I was the problem. But over the years, through reflection, through writing, My Inner Child Was Broken, through conversations in Unfiltered Human, I've come to see that those accusations were defenses. They were projections of other people's discomfort with limits. They were attempts to make me doubt my body's truth. Today, I don't engage in endless cycles anymore. If someone shows me early on that they cannot respect my boundaries, I take it seriously. I act in real time. That doesn't mean I cut people off harshly or without compassion. But it does mean I no longer wait for years, hoping that what is already visible will somehow transform. This clarity has cost me relationships, but it has also saved me from far greater costs. It has preserved my self-respect, my energy, my authenticity. And it has opened space for connections where yes and no are equally honored. Boundaries as intimacy tests every relationship, tests boundaries. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes unconsciously. A request is made, a need is expressed, a limit is set. The response determines whether trust grows or erodes. When a boundary is respected, intimacy deepens. The nervous system relaxes, safety grows. Love becomes spacious, alive. When a boundary is violated, intimacy collapses. Even if the relationship continues, something essential is lost. Trust becomes brittle. The nervous system stays on alert. Love becomes survival. Boundaries, then, are not barriers to intimacy. They are the conditions for intimacy. They are the tests that reveal whether love is real or illusory. The role of projection in boundary conflict. One of the things I've noticed repeatedly is how boundaries trigger projection. When I set a boundary, some people immediately interpret it as rejection. They project their own fears of abandonment or inadequacy onto me. Instead of hearing no, they hear you are unworthy. This projection creates conflict where none needs to exist. But I've come to see it as part of the human struggle. We all carry wounds. We all fear rejection. Boundaries touch those wounds directly. The key is recognizing the difference between projection and reality. My no is not about someone else's worth. It is about my capacity, my limit, my truth. To confuse those things is to collapse the boundary and lose clarity. Attachment patterns and boundaries. Attachment theory sheds light on this. Anxiously attached individuals often see boundaries as threats, fearing that no means abandonment. Avoidantly attached individuals may use rigid boundaries as armor, pushing people away before they can be hurt. Secure attachment, by contrast, allows boundaries to be fluid but firm. Yes and no are both possible, both safe. In my own journey, I've moved across these patterns. I've been anxious, desperate to hold on. I've been avoidant, withdrawing into solitude. Only through healing, reflection, and self-trust have I begun to approach secure attachment, where boundaries no longer feel like walls or weapons, but like bridges. Family legacies of boundary collapse. It's impossible to talk about boundaries in relationships without mentioning family. Many of our struggles begin there. If, as children, we were not allowed to say no, to refuse a hug, to ask for space, to express discomfort, then, as adults, we will likely struggle to hold boundaries in love. I remember moments from my own childhood when my boundaries were dismissed, times when saying no was punished, when expressing discomfort was met with minimization or ridicule. Those moments trained my nervous system to associate no with danger. It's no surprise that in adult life I often froze or fawned instead of holding firm. Breaking that cycle has been one of the hardest tasks of healing. It requires reteaching the nervous system that no is safe, that it will not lead to abandonment or punishment. It requires surrounding myself with people who respect limits, who honor boundaries, who do not make my truth into a threat. Boundaries as repair. The good news is that boundaries can be relearned. They are not fixed. Even after years of collapse, it is possible to rebuild. In my relationships now, I practice small acts of boundary repair. Saying no to an invitation when I'm tired. Naming discomfort instead of swallowing it. Walking away from disrespect instead of tolerating it. Each small act retrains the nervous system. Each one builds trust in me. And in return, I've found that the relationships which remain are stronger, healthier, more alive. People who can hear no without collapsing are people who can love without controlling. And that is the kind of intimacy worth cultivating. Boundaries in relationships are never easy. They require courage, honesty, and sometimes loss. But they are the only path to authentic intimacy. Without them, love becomes manipulation. With them, love becomes freedom. For me, the journey has been one of moving from endless cycles of tolerance to real-time clarity, from self-abandonment to self-respect, from projection and guilt to compassion and truth. I no longer see boundaries as the end of connection. I see them as the beginning. They are not walls but doorways, openings into relationships where both people can be fully themselves, without fear, without collapse, without erasure. Practices for embodying boundaries. We've spoken of boundaries as philosophy, as culture, as a relationship, but none of this matters unless it becomes lived. Boundaries are not ideas we hold in our heads. They are signals we feel in our bodies. They are choices we act on in real time. They are practices we return to again and again until they become second nature. So what does it mean to actually embody boundaries? To let the body speak its no and its yes clearly, without shame, without collapse. To let the nervous system's truth become a guide rather than an enemy. The practices that follow are not abstract strategies. They are invitations to listen to the body, to work with its signals rather than against them, to teach it gently, consistently, that its truth matters. Listening for the somatic yes and no. The first step in embodying boundaries is noticing how the body says yes and no. This is subtler than it sounds. Often, we've been so conditioned to override these signals that we barely notice them. Yes might feel like warmth in the chest, ease in the breath, leaning forward, opening hands. No might feel like a tightening of the gut, a holding of the shoulders, a step back, a reluctance in the voice. To practice, think of a recent invitation you received, a social gathering, a request for help, or an opportunity. Recall your first bodily response before you reasoned it away. Did your stomach flutter with excitement? Did your jaw tighten with dread? That was your boundary speaking. Journaling these micro signals helps retrain attention. Over time, the yes and no become clearer, less tangled in guilt or second guessing. Breath and grounding as boundary anchors. When saying no feels threatening, the body often tips into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Breath becomes shallow, the chest constricts, the nervous system floods. Grounding through breath is a way of telling the body, it is safe to speak the truth. Try this practice. Place both feet on the floor. Inhale slowly to a count of 4, feeling the belly expand. Exhale to a count of 6, letting the shoulders drop. As you breathe, silently repeat, I'm safe. My no is safe. This isn't about performing calm for others. It's about creating enough physiological safety that the boundary can be spoken about without collapse. Role play and rehearsal boundaries are muscles. They grow stronger with practice. One way to train them is through role play. This can be done with a therapist, a trusted friend, or even alone. Choose simple scenarios. Someone asks for your time when you are tired. Someone makes a joke that hurts. Someone pushes for intimacy you don't want. Practice saying no clearly, without apology. Notice how your body responds. Do your shoulders rise? Does your throat tighten? These signals reveal where fear still lingers. With repetition, the body begins to associate no with strength rather than danger. Journaling, mapping boundary ruptures and repairs, writing is another powerful tool. By mapping when boundaries are honored and when they are broken, patterns emerge. In your journal, create 3 columns. 1. Situation, what happened? 2. Body signal, what did you feel? 3. Response, what did you do? Over time, this reveals the gaps between the body's truth and the action taken. It also highlights progress, the moments when you did honor the no, when you did protect your energy. I remember when I first started doing this, the gap was enormous. My body said no constantly, but my mouth said yes. Over time, I began to notice small shifts, fewer betrayals of self, more alignment between body and action, spiritual and creative practices. For some, boundaries are strengthened through spiritual or creative ritual. This might mean meditation, prayer, or art. In meditation, boundaries can be visualized as light or energy fields. Imagine a sphere around your body, flexible but firm, permeable but protective. As you breathe, see it expand and contract, adjusting to what feels safe. In art, boundaries can be expressed through color, shape, or form. Drawing a thick line across a page, painting concentric circles, writing poetry about no and yes, these acts externalize what is often internalized. They make the invisible visible. For me, writing has always been this practice. Through my inner child was broken and the inversiverse, I found words for experiences that had long lived only in my body. The act of naming was itself a boundary. This is what happened, this is what I felt, this is my truth. Collective practices, boundaries are not only individual. Communities can model and teach them. Imagine schools that honor a child's no, workplaces that respect rest, cultures that see saying no as an act of integrity rather than defiance. Some indigenous practices already embody this. Circles where everyone's voice is heard, where silence is respected as much as speech, where consent is embedded in ritual. These remind us that boundaries are not just about protecting the self, but about protecting the whole. In my own journey, I've noticed how collective denial of boundaries fuels systemic abuse. Governments gaslight, media manipulates, and corporations exploit. The nervous system of society is dysregulated, addicted to cortisol and dopamine. Part of healing, then, is not just personal boundary repair, but cultural boundary repair. We must learn to say no collectively, no to exploitation, no to indoctrination, no to endless extraction of energy and attention. Personal reflection, embodying no as love. Looking back, I see how long it took me to embody boundaries. For years, I set them in theory, but not in practice. I said no in my head, but yes in my actions. I tolerated what hurt me because I didn't want to lose love, approval, and connection. The cost was immense, self-worth eroded, authenticity suppressed, and the nervous system strained. But as I've grown, I've learned to embody no as an act of love, love for myself, love for the other, love for the relationship. Because a no spoken in truth protects everyone involved. Now, when I sense projection, manipulation, or disregard, I don't wait. I act in real time. That doesn't mean I'm cold or harsh. It means I trust my body. I trust the signals that once confused me. I no longer need others to validate me. Boundaries are not weapons. They are not punishments. They are not rejections. They are invitations to connect with honesty, to love without coercion, to live without collapse. Practices for embodying boundaries are not quick fixes. They are lifelong disciplines. They require courage, repetition, and compassion. But they are worth it. Because boundaries are the difference between surviving relationships and thriving in them. They are the difference between love as control and love as freedom. They are the difference between a life of self-abandonment and a life of authenticity. To embody boundaries is to reclaim the nervous system's language. It is to say my yes and my no matter. It is to live in truth. Integration and closing reflection. When we speak of boundaries, it is tempting to treat them as neat, definable lines. Clear edges of the self, firm rules about what comes in and what stays out. But lived experience shows us that boundaries are never this tidy. They are dynamic, shifting, sometimes porous, sometimes rigid. They are not the static walls of a fortress, but the breathing skin of a living body. Over the last parts of this episode, we've explored boundaries as physiology, culture, philosophy, relationships, and practice. What comes into focus now is how these threads weave together into something much larger, a vision of boundaries as the grammar of intimacy and the foundation of authenticity. Boundaries as paradox. Separating and connecting, one of the central paradoxes of boundaries is they both separate and connect. To say no might look like distance. But in truth, it creates the only conditions under which genuine closeness can exist. If I cannot say no safely, then my yes will always be contaminated by fear, compliance, or resentment. Boundaries, then, are not barriers to intimacy. They are the gatekeepers of it. They ensure that when we step toward each other, we do so freely, not under coercion or collapse. They remind us that the deepest connection is not found in fusion or enmeshment, but in the dance between two differentiated selves who can meet without losing themselves. This paradox is not unique to psychology. Mystical traditions across cultures have spoken of it. The Taoist balance of yin and yang, the Christian idea of communion without annihilation of self, the Buddhist insight that interdependence requires awareness of distinction. Boundaries are not anti-connection. They are the architecture of sacred connection. The nervous system is the first boundary. If boundaries are the grammar of intimacy, then the nervous system is the alphabet. Long before words are spoken, the body signals its yes and its no. The skin tingles, the gut clenches, the breath expands or contracts. These signals are the body's first language, often far more accurate than the rational stories we build on top of them. Learning to live in integrity with boundaries means returning to these signals. It means listening to the body before the mind rushes in to rationalize. It means honoring contraction as much as expansion, discomfort as much as delight. Too often we dismiss the body's no as weakness or fear. But what if we treated it instead as wisdom? What if contraction was not something to override, but something to understand? What if the nervous system's refusal was not sabotage, but protection? Boundaries and the rewriting of memory boundaries also play a role in how we remember and restory our lives. When boundaries are ignored or violated, the body encodes those moments as threat, as trauma, as loops that repeat. But when we learn to set boundaries, we begin to create new patterns, new embodied memories that say, this time I was respected. This time I protected myself. This time the story ended differently. Each act of honoring a boundary becomes an act of rewriting the nervous system's script. The brain records not only what was endured, but also what was overcome. Over time, the balance shifts. Trauma loops loosen and resilience loops form. This is why boundary work is not just about preventing harm. It is about teaching the body new possibilities. It is about showing oneself that safety is possible, respect is possible, and a land of love without collapse is possible. Boundaries as resistance to systemic control. On the personal level, boundaries protect authenticity. But on the collective level, they become acts of resistance. Systems of power, governments, corporations, and media thrive on collapsed boundaries. They want us pliable, compliant, overextended. They flood us with fear and distraction so that our nervous systems stay too overwhelmed to say no. To reclaim boundaries, then, is not just a psychological act but a political one. Every no to manipulation, every yes to integrity, every refusal to self-abandon chips away at those systems. When enough people embody their boundaries, the culture shifts. The economy of extraction falters. The narratives of fear lose their grip. Boundaries are thus revolutionary. They protect not just individuals but societies. They remind us that freedom is not granted from above, but reclaimed from within. The cost of boundary collapse. To understand the value of boundaries, we must also acknowledge the cost of their absence. When boundaries collapse, relationships spiral into resentment or abuse. Communities fracture into exploitation. Individuals lose themselves in cycles of fawning, freezing, or exploding. Without boundaries, love becomes control, generosity becomes obligation, and intimacy becomes enmeshment. Without boundaries, even the noblest ideals can turn toxic. Spiritual communities collapse into cults, families into prisons, and nations into empires. This is why boundaries are not luxuries. They are survival tools, and yet they are more than survival. They are the foundation of thriving. Reclaiming no as sacred, yes as authentic. The work of integration is learning to treat no as sacred and yes as authentic. No is not rejection, it is protection. Yes is not compliance, it is freedom. When the body learns to say no without collapse, yes becomes more joyful. Relationships become less about control and more about choice. Communities become less about conformity and more about co-creation. In my own journey, this has meant unlearning decades of scripts. It has meant facing the guilt that rises when I refuse, the projections that land when I walk away, the discomfort of standing firm when others want me pliable. It has meant remembering again and again that I do not need to endlessly explain my no, and that my yes means nothing if it is not rooted in truth. This is the heart of boundary integration, to let the body's signals guide us into integrity, to live in the tension between separation and connection, to reclaim no and yes as the most sacred words we can speak. Living boundaries collectively, integration also means asking what boundaries might look like collectively. What would it mean for communities, workplaces, and governments to honor boundaries rather than exploit them? Imagine schools where children's no is respected rather than punished. Workplaces where rest is seen as productivity, not laziness. Families where silence is honored as much as speech. nations where sovereignty is mutual rather than imperial. These may sound idealistic, but they are not impossible. They are simply unfamiliar, and they begin with individuals who embody their boundaries. Each person who honors their own yes and no creates ripple effects. They model for others, they shift the culture, they plant seeds for collective healing. A reflection on where I stand now. For me, learning boundaries has been one of the most difficult and most liberating journeys of my life. I've spoken of the times I ignored red flags, the times I self-abandoned, the times I confused tolerance with love. I've shared how costly those mistakes were to my self-respect, my mental health, and my sense of worth. But I've also spoken of the transformation that came when I began to listen to my body, to act in real time, to treat my no as sacred and my yes as authentic. I no longer wait months or years for disrespect to erode me. I act in the moment. I no longer need external validation to trust my signals. I honor them because they are mine. This is not about perfection. I still struggle. I still sometimes hesitate, still sometimes explain too much, still sometimes feel guilt. But the difference is that now I recover quicker. I no longer spiral into collapse. I return to the center faster. And I trust that each act of boundary setting strengthens the nervous system's memory of safety. This is what integration feels like, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of trust. Boundaries as love. So as we close this episode, I want to return to the simplest truth. Boundaries are love. They are the love we show ourselves by honoring our truth. They are the love we offer others by refusing to deceive them with false yeses. They are the love we gift relationships by creating the conditions for real intimacy. Boundaries are not about pushing people away. They are about making connections sustainable. They are not about control. They are about freedom. They are not about loss. They are about wholeness. In episode 22, we explored the push-pull of intimacy, how desire and fear collide in the nervous system. Today, we've seen how that collision makes boundaries necessary, how the nervous system speaks its yes and its no, and how culture and conditioning try to silence that speech. We've looked at the practices that help us embody boundaries, at the personal costs of ignoring them, and at the revolutionary potential of reclaiming them. And we've integrated all of this into a vision of boundaries as the grammar of intimacy and the foundation of authenticity. As we move forward, we'll step into the next terrain. Episode 24, The Nervous System in Sex and Love. Here we'll explore how arousal, safety, and intimacy intertwine, why dissociation sometimes surfaces during intimacy, and how embodiment can be reclaimed in sexual connection. Until then, thank you for listening. Thank you for walking this path with me. I hope this episode offered not just insight, but compassion for yourself, for others, and for the part of you still learning to say no with courage and yes with joy. You've been listening to The Body Knows, James Miller.